Fears grow of a war following the US assassination of Iran's top military commander. European nations are criticized for weak responses to Qassam Soleimani's death. Along with the collapsing nuclear deal, has Europe's Iran policy failed? And is it time for a rethink? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Europe appears caught in the middle. The targeted killing of Iran's most powerful general by the US has raised the possibility of a war. Many countries are urging restraint as they try to balance relations with both sides. The EU's new foreign policy chief has invited Iran's foreign minister to Brussels to discuss not only the assassination but the efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal that the US pulled out of nearly 2 years ago. Tehran has repeatedly accused Europe of not doing enough to support the agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA.
We consider Russia and China as partners that have helped us in JCPOA, have held strong positions, and who contribute to the continued survival of JCPOA. Unfortunately, we have not seen the same approach from the Europeans. They have not been able or willing to take the necessary action in order to fulfill their obligations under JCPOA.
A number of European leaders have warned against further escalation in the region. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, said the cycle of violence, provocations and retaliations which we have witnessed in Iraq over the past few weeks has to stop. Further escalation must be avoided at all costs. The risk is a generalized flare-up of violence in the whole region and the rise of obscure forces of terrorism that thrive at times of religious and nationalist tensions. The UK's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said the US had a right to self-defense, adding, "We have always recognized the aggressive threat posed by the Iranian Quds force led by Qassam Soleimani. Following his death, we urge all parties to de-escalate. Further conflict is in none of our interests." While France has raised concerns over what it sees as a power struggle, Germany has blamed Iran for provoking the US.
On se réveille dans un monde plus dangereux. L'escalade militaire est toujours dangereuse.
We are waking up in a more dangerous world. Military escalation is always dangerous. That's why France always works and looks for conditions of stability.
Et donc nous allons continuer à le faire.
What we feared is happening. The heightening of the power struggle between the United States and Iran.
Entre les États-Unis et donc l'Iran.
The American action is a reaction to a whole series of provocations for which Iran bears responsibility. I would remind you of the attacks on tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and the Saudi oil plants. We are at a dangerous point of escalation, and it is up to us to contribute to a de-escalation with prudence and restraint.
Speaking on US television, the Secretary of State expressed frustration with Europe's response.
Frankly, the Europeans haven't been as helpful as I wish that they could be. The Brits, the French, the Germans all need to understand that what we did, what the Americans did, saved lives in Europe as well. Qassam Soleimani led, and his IRGC led assassination campaigns in Europe. This was a good thing for the entire world.
Let's introduce the panel. In Tehran, Hassan Ahmadian, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tehran. In Stockholm, by Skype, Rouzbeh Parsi, head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And in Istanbul, also by Skype, Matthew Brizza, a former US diplomat. Welcome to you all. Hassan, is there any general sentiment now in Tehran that it's about time to respond to the invitation that has been expanded by the European Union for Foreign Minister to meet with European officials there about the assassination of Qassam Soleimani and reviving the agreement, the nuclear deal?
Well, I think Europeans, according to the Iranian view, have diminish their leverage with in the region and in the Middle East in general with regards to the JCPOA as well, by not responding to US's reimposition of sanctions on Iran, and by taking the same rhetoric that the United States speak of Iran in the region. We know that Iranians consider Soleimani a national hero, for instance, and who fought the number one enemy of ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the region. He is assassinated by the United States, and instead of condemning this on the European part, the Europeans are repeating the same rhetoric and messaging of the United States. That is, he was a threat to the region and stability in the region, which is really something that is diminishing US's leverage with regards to Iran. I think Iranians have been, in their previous stages in the 90s and the 2000s have continued their cooperation with the EU because they thought that the EU can play a balancing role vis-a-vis the United States. Now, with the fate of the JCPOA, the way the United States is treating its allies, and the way the European, very modestly, very slowly in their reactions, and if there is any reaction at all, they are telling the Iranians that we don't have that balancing role. So I think their leverage in Iran is really weakened nowadays.
Rouzbeh, if that leverage has been weakened, what do you think should be the incentives presented by the EU for Iran to be able to say, you know what, we think we should join the talks with you about any future agreement?
Well, I mean, in that sense, we have to go back and look at what's happened in the last 18 months. And the Europeans have had quite some time to come up with new and innovative solutions, and so far not come up with much because they're so dependent on the United States. So I don't think the assassination of Qassam Soleimani makes that much of a difference in terms of what the Europeans have in terms of capacity. Of course, it makes it more urgent. But for now, the reactions have been rather tepid. And I think the balancing act that they're doing vis-a-vis the US and Iran, they will always tip towards the US.
Matthew, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt in the mind of any political analyst that this is a critical moment, and that to prevent war, you need strong diplomatic action. Are the Europeans best positioned to step in?
They're not positioned to step in unless Washington and Tehran wish them to. They simply don't have the leverage, as both guests have said, to make an impact. What they can do is what President Macron was trying to do throughout the summer, play a mediating role, host talks. You'll recall that he was hoping there would be a discussion between President Trump and maybe President Rouhani this summer that Macron was brokering. And, that approach, it was working to a certain degree. It's clear that President Trump and the Iranian leadership do not want war. It's clear that President Trump was almost begging President Rouhani to speak. President Rouhani chose not to. President Trump showed a lot of restraint through the summer in response to the mining of tankers, the shooting down of the U.S. drone, the attack on the oil facility in Saudi Arabia. And I think he was doing that because he had some hope and trust in the European mediation. Now, of course, after the assassination of Soleimani, it's not realistic to expect the Iranian government to come to the table anytime soon before it's had a chance to exact some revenge. But at the end of the day, once that revenge is finished, if Washington does not overreact, which it sounds like it's threatening to, but if it does not overreact, I think the basic building blocks are there to move forward. Again, neither Iran nor the United States want war. What Trump wants ultimately is to say he negotiated a better nuclear deal than Obama did. The Europeans are open to that. The question is, will and when Tehran be open to restarting talks as well?
Hassan, I interviewed Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif a few months ago, and basically he said that that Iran feels betrayed by the European Union because they said, take the nuclear deal and what happens next will be more prosperity for the Iranian people. They don't see that. Is this sentiment going to be further exacerbated with the assassination of Qassam Soleimani?
Well, I think, look, the EU is not a mediator. It's part of the deal. It signed the deal. It is committed to the deal. It's not a mediator. We don't need a mediator. They are committed to what they signed. It's not easy to say. I mean, it's easy to say that they are mediators. They need Iran and U.S. to agree to their mediating role. But the deal says they have signed it and they are committed to it. So it's not about being mediating between Iran and the United States. With regards to the current situation, I think the Iranians have came to the bitter conclusion that the EU is, according to Foreign Minister Zarif and many others, I mean officials, that the EU is not only not willing to for the JCPOA to survive, but also it's not doing. I mean, it's not only not capable, but it's not willing to safeguard the JCPOA. Otherwise, I mean, the special purpose vehicle was not. They didn't do that much to make it function. The credit line that they offered, they waited for Trump with his maximum pressure to give them the green light to go further, which was absurd because he had this maximum pressure. He don't want to let Iranians ease the pressure on the Iranians. So their role actually, and it is hard for the Iranians to understand why the biggest economic bloc in the world cannot give a credit line on its own without the permission of the United States. So the Europeans have in effect decreased their say and word in Tehran.
Rouzbeh, the French Secretary of State for European Affairs said, I'm quoting him, "We have woken up to a more dangerous world." This is a statement that drew a rebuke from the White House. Is this a way of the French saying basically that they completely disagree with the Americans when it comes to the assassination of Qassam Soleimani?
I think that's perhaps a bit of an overinterpretation. The French, a bit like the British, but not to the same extent, always will hedge their bets, and they will always be careful about how far they will go in differing from the American position. We go back to the war against Iraq in 2003, you can see how traumatic that sense was of not being in the same line as the Americans. But I think what the French are pointing out, which is obvious to everyone, it seems, except Mike Pompeo, is that the world is going to be more dangerous now because it's going to be much, much more unpredictable. And because, as your guest in Istanbul said, the Iranians will exact some kind of revenge. And the point with revenge is that you cannot foresee, nor can you guarantee that the reaction to the revenge will be proportionate enough for you to not then have to react to that as well. I mean, the reason why we are in this mess now is that they're constantly trying to show deterrence vis-a-vis the other side by punishing what they consider to be an escalation. And their own punishment is then the next element of escalation. So the Iranian revenge, in whatever shape or form it comes, will by definition elicit an American response. And the question is, will anyone in Tehran and DC then have a break which they can use to break the cycle and slow this down? And that's an open question. So by definition, yes, a much more dangerous way.
Okay. Matthew, the pundits are trying to piece together the intentions of Mike Pompeo when he said in his rebuke that the reaction of the Europeans was not sufficiently supportive. Well, what do you think he means by that?
Yeah, I think he's way off base here. When I listened to even the clips that you played at the beginning of the show, what I heard from the Germans and French is actually maintenance of solidarity with the United States. And the point of our guest in Tehran is well taken, that the European Union and the member states are signatories, but there's no chance in this day and age that the European allies of the United States are simply going to break with the United States because of this agreement they signed. Maybe that's unjust, but it's a reflection of raw power. And it's impossible for European Union entities, business entities, to function if, in fact, their governments break with the United States on this, and then the United States uses the financial system to damage those companies. So I hear that the Europeans in those quotes are maintaining solidarity with the U.S. I think Mike Pompeo wants too much. He wants some cheerleading from the European allies. He wants to use that to try to isolate Tehran and deter that revenge response. I think it's unwise. I think it would be much wiser to try to get back to where things were just 1 week ago today, where the United States, in response to those continuing attacks on military bases in Iraq, launched the attack against the Iranian militia, Kataib Hezbollah. Then there was the attack on the U.S. Embassy, and then the militia was pulling back. It got the orders to pull back. That was the great opportunity. If Pompeo is right, if he's truthful, that General Soleimani was on the ground in Baghdad to plan a new and large-scale attack, that was a blunder by Iran in terms of escalation. That was the moment of opportunity, and I think it's crucial to get back to that once the dust settles, with the U.S. not criticizing its European allies, but relying on their support.
Hassan, we do understand the overwhelming sense of anger in Tehran, but as you know, people should go about their daily lives as soon as possible. And the question here is, against the backdrop of the political landscape that you have now, the Americans pulling out from the 2015 agreement, sanctions, assassination of Qassam Soleimani, to move forward, I think Iran ultimately will have to have the backing or the support of someone who might build bridges between Iran and the Americans. Europeans could be in this position, one of the most legitimate blocs to do that. Why you keep insisting that the Europeans have become somehow irrelevant from an Iranian perspective?
Well, because they failed what they signed on. They failed the Iranians in their JCPOA, the most important agreement Iran has signed over the past 4 decades. So for Iranians, the Europeans are not legitimate anymore as a global power. So for Iranians, for instance, if I was on the call in Tehran, I would rather go deal with China, Russia, and the United States itself maybe in the future, rather than try to bring in a party that is not even trying to, live up to its commitments. So I think that if there's a will, which I think is not for now, there are many bridges. Iran doesn't need Europe only as a bridge. It needed it as a global power, which Europe is telling Iran, we are not.
Rouzbeh, for the Europeans to be able to get their act together, act as a mediator, do they really understand that Trump is unpredictable, that the Iranians feel like with the assassination of Qassam Soleimani, that their stature as the most powerful regional player has been completely compromised by this act, and that ultimately, if they don't exact revenge, their image might suffer massively in this part of the world? What should the Europeans do against the backdrop of this complex political landscape to move forward?
Well, that's a good question. But I mean, in order to be able to answer that, we have to take a step back and look at what kind of a beast is the European Union itself. And I mean, the European Union has in the last couple of years been ridden by different kinds of internal problems and conflicts between various groups of member states. It has to deal with Brexit and the fact that the Brits have a slightly different approach to the United States than even the French or the Germans. And the fact that France and Germany have been busy with their own internal domestic politics much more than European politics, let alone dealing with a country like Iran, which for them at the moment presents more of a problem than a promise. So in that sense, the Europeans are far too busy with themselves to really be able to act as an entity that could sign yet another agreement. What they might be able to do is to mediate, and to mediate an attempt to de-escalate the situation, which at this moment is crucial and more than good enough. But in the long run, that's all it amounts to. It doesn't amount to an active player that can bring all the parties together and make them sign the new deal. And the reason they can't do that, A, they can't bring themselves together. B, they've already shown that the last time they signed something, they couldn't deliver on it. And C, the Americans will not play ball, not even with the Europeans.
Matthew, as a former US diplomat, you know that sometimes to break an impasse, you need to offer a solid offer to the other party to be able to break the ice. And now for the Europeans to build a serious plan. What is it that which they should present to the Iranians, for the Iranians to say, you know what? Okay, let's do business.
Well, for years, I was part of U.S. and European mediating teams, mediating the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, the conflicts in Georgia, and the Cyprus conflict. And what I found throughout that experience is my European colleagues, my friends, our allies, do not do power politics well. They don't understand leverage. They understand process. The EU, after all, is all about process. It's about using rules and regulations to eliminate conflict. The moment we're in now is one of raw power playing itself out. It's Iran angry, about to exact revenge, but in the end being left alone with Russia and China, not the most savory partners in the world. And it's Donald Trump left not alone, but with European allies who are not robustly supporting him. And a president whose strategic vision amounts to coming up with a new deal with Iran, but he doesn't have a way to sit down at the table. So therefore, given that Europe doesn't have the appetite for raw power politics, they can provide a venue, a fig leaf, a justification for President Trump to climb down from statements like Mike Pompeo's and arrange a meeting like was talked about over the summer between President Rouhani, President Trump, once the emotions have died down in Iran. I can't believe the world is going to evolve such that the U.S. and Iran are just going to move up that escalatory ladder our friend in Stockholm was talking about and face each other in an all-out war. That's just not conceivable in my mind. It's not in anyone's interests.
Okay. Hassan, Rouzbeh, I think you want to say something? If you can say it briefly, please.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I agree, but the problem is this. If the Europeans are all about process, the problem with Trump is that he doesn't understand process at all. And if you look at the JCPOA as a kind of a way of doing things, a roadmap, you see that the reason it succeeded was that it contained a lot of process through which you could build confidence. And there's absolutely no confidence in Tehran for Donald Trump at the moment.
Hassan, correct me if I'm wrong. I've seen Iranian officials, commentators, their allies in Iraq, saying basically that it's about time for the Americans to pull out from the region. Do they imply Iraq on its own, or are they talking about the whole region? Is that the price the Iranians are asking for the assassination of Qassam Soleimani?
I think Iran has had this rhetoric that the region is better off without a U.S. presence, but they have been coexisting with the U.S. presence in the region. Now the situation is different. There's a bill that will be passed, I think, tomorrow or the day after in the Iraqi parliament, through the Iraqi parliament, that calls for the exclusion of the U.S. from Iraq. I think that policy has changed on Iran parts as well, because Iranians will not coexist easily with the United States in the region.
This is going to be my last question to Matthew. Matthew, I've heard you saying basically you don't think this is going to boil down to a full-blown military confrontation. But as you know, this is an uncharted territory for everyone. This is something that we have never seen before. Aren't you concerned that this could be the tinderbox?
Oh, sure. I'm concerned. I mean, it's impossible really to conceive of something that has never, ever happened, or it's difficult to. Maybe we're saying the same thing. But I think I think ultimately the objectives of the governments in both Tehran and Washington are not as dissimilar as we might think. Again, at the risk of repeating myself, Donald Trump does not want confrontation, a military confrontation with Iran. He showed that through the summer when he constantly resisted a retaliatory strike. He wants a new deal, a better deal as he sees it with Tehran. I think that Tehran would be happy with a new agreement, even though it has to say now you're violating this existing agreement, that's wrong. It'd be happy with one if there was sanctions relief. So that's the deal. If Trump really wants the agreement, offer sanctions relief.
Good to talk to you.
But sure, there could be.
Matthew Briza, Rouzbeh Parsi, Hassan Ahmadian, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha, Bye for now.